A thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me! And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB+ radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, he's gone. A dramatic day yesterday saw the ousting of the chair of the Conservative Party after a very quick investigation by Sir Laurie Magnus. What is the fallout? What did the Prime Minister know and when? And we turn to the economy. What did Jeremy Hunt really mean on Friday when he said we can use our Brexit freedoms? We'll explore all of those questions after the headlines.
Good morning, it's 9:31. I'm Tamsin Roberts in the GB Newsroom. The Prime Minister is still under pressure following the sacking of Nadhim Zahawi, with the Labour Party urging Rishi Sunak to come clean. Labour's Deputy Leader Angela Rayner has written to Mr Sunak asking him what he knew about the investigation into Mr Zahawi's tax affairs and when. The Prime Minister sacked the Conservative Party chairman yesterday following an ethics inquiry that found he'd committed a serious breach of the ministerial code. Former Special Advisor to Mr Zahawi, Mark Lehane, told GB News that despite the findings of the inquiry, the former Chancellor has still done a good job as a local MP.
He's a very popular local MP. I know you had some voices there that weren't so keen. He's done a pretty good job. He's got a big majority, and I think that it would be a real shame if every time people made a mistake that they were thrown out of public life. Any of us, if we'd had allegations made against us in our jobs or our private lives, would probably want to have a chance for a process to run out so we can get our side of the story across. But we have had that now. It did find against Nadeem. Nadeem's been sacked. That's very sad. I think it's a chance for everyone to go away and reflect upon it before any more decisions are made.
The Prime Minister will announce a £1 billion emergency care plan today as the NHS continues to face severe pressures. Rishi Sunak is expected to pledge 800 new ambulances, 5,000 more hospital beds, as well as expanding urgent care to people's homes over the next 2 years. However, experts are warning there should be a bigger focus on staff shortages and a lack of funding. Last-minute talks between teaching unions and the government are being held today in an effort to avoid strike action this week in England and Wales. Members of the National Education Union will meet with the Education Secretary after previous talks failed to break the deadlock. Thousands of teachers are planning to strike on Wednesday in a dispute over pay and conditions, with up to 23,000 schools being affected. The teacher strike is part of the biggest day of industrial action to hit the UK in decades. This Wednesday, up to 500,000 public service workers, including train and bus drivers, civil servants and university lecturers, will protest against plummeting living standards and a high rate of inflation. The government says it can't afford to meet the pay demands of every industry taking action. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Tom Harwood.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. 9:34, I should have said. The story that consumed Westminster last week has come to what the government now hopes to be a conclusion with the unceremonious sacking of former Tory party chairman Nadeem Zahawi yesterday morning. The Prime Minister continues to face questions, however, about his judgment and about his commitment to those three famous promises made on the steps of Downing Street: integrity, professionalism and accountability at every level of government. Sunak had sacked Zahawi within 2 hours of receiving Sir Laurie's independent report, unusually early on a Sunday morning. That found Zahawi had breached the ministerial code multiple times in relation to his taxes, 7 times to be precise. Now, the Magnus report details how Zahawi pled ignorance of the HMRC probe, which began in April 2021, despite the fact that he and his advisers attended a meeting with HMRC in June of that year. Then, in July 2022, when concerns over the tax affairs arose while he was Chancellor, Zahawi referred to those suggestions as smears and did not correct the record until January this year. Now, Sir Laurie found this to be inconsistent with the ministerial requirement for openness. Earlier today on GB News, Health Minister Helen Whately spoke to GB News and said that the Prime Minister had done the right thing.
The Prime Minister made the decision to remove Nadeem Zahawi from his position in government. He did that once he got the report in from the independent ethics advisor, which was very clear about what had or hadn't happened, and so the Prime Minister rightly made that decision.
He'd made the admission that he'd paid this penalty to HMRC. We knew that he had been Chancellor when he's being investigated by them. It didn't need an independent panel for the Prime Minister to take the action, did it?
Actually, it's a pretty serious thing for somebody to be removed from their job as a minister in the government, and something like that should follow a fair and proper process. That's why the Prime Minister asked his independent ethics advisor to look into it. Sir Laurie Magnus did that and then set out very clearly his judgment, which was then the basis of which the Prime Minister made the decision to remove Nadeem Zahawi.
Health Minister Helen Whately speaking a little bit earlier today. Well, as the Lib Dems have now waded in to call for Zahawi to stand down not just as a minister, but as an MP too, we've been speaking to the people of his constituency of Stratford-upon-Avon to see how they feel.
He broke the rules, he deserves to get the sack, doesn't he? Everybody has got to pay their taxes, he didn't do it right, so he deserves a sack. Simple as that, same as anybody else, really.
I think he should have resigned, really, and it's taken a long time. And again, I think, you know, it's been this big delay in is he going to go, isn't he going to go, and nobody actually makes any decision until the public, you know, opinion becomes so strong that they think they've got to do something about it, really. So I wish they'd called a general election, actually, because I think, you know, we've got another 2 years, haven't we, of this mess, really. And, you know, I'd quite like to have a bit of a change.
I think he had it coming to him. He should have.
I think he should have been
resigned.
honest.
He should have resigned at the beginning of the week.
And it's not the first time he's had question marks about his team.
Well, there are some views from Lichfield. I'm joined now in the studio by Michael Fabricant, friend of the show, and Conservative views from Stratford-upon-Avon, I should have said. I believe I said Lichfield, which, of course, is the constituency of our next guest. Michael Fabricant, Conservative MP for Lichfield and friend of the show. Michael, first of all, you've known Nadeem Zahawi for well over a decade. You've been colleagues on those green benches. How have you reacted to the last week, this sort of media storm and then this really quite quick conclusion?
Well, very mixed reactions. I mean, firstly, I used to be in business before I was a Member of Parliament. I remember in my own business we had an HMRC investigation. Actually, it turned out that they owed us money, but it took them a week of several accountants being in our offices to work that out. And, you know, paying a penalty is not that unusual when you're in dispute with HMRC. And YouGov, as you know, is a very big corporation with offices in the United Kingdom, America, and other countries. So I was sympathetic. But, you know, it was becoming a distraction. And while a distraction, a political distraction, has got nothing to do with justice, I think that the Prime Minister, and I very rarely agree, actually, with our front bench on most things, but on this thing, I think Helen Whately and the Prime Minister was right. He was right to wait until an inquiry had gone in, and you outlined extremely well where the difficulties were. Yes, Nadeem Zahawi did tell the civil servants that there was a dispute going on, but it should have been in writing. You have to do things properly. But I can tell you, as a former minister, that the ministerial code is quite complicated, so people do make mistakes. But I think Rishi was absolutely right to wait, and I think he was absolutely right to make the decision that he did.
It is interesting to read the Sir Laurie Magnus report, which doesn't really criticise Nadeem Zahawi for the fact that he was investigated by HMRC, for the fact that he paid a penalty. It criticises him on multiple occasions for not disclosing it when it happened. Now, as you say, you have been investigated, or your business was. You came out smelling of roses, but to what extent should Nadeem Zahawi have just been open and honest throughout this process? Might he still be the chairman of the Conservative Party if he had been?
Yes, absolutely right. You know, I remember when I first became an MP, all those years ago, someone said to me, a very old grand character, and he said, you know, you can murder your wife, Michael, not that I'm married, but you could murder your wife, Michael, as long as you're open with the House of Commons and declare it, and if necessary, apologise to the whole House. And I think that was a slight exaggeration, yes, right. But openness is the key word, and he wasn't open.
It's the classic line from Watergate, I believe it first came up. It's not the crime, it's the cover-up that
exactly
really gets
right.
you. Yeah, so wider context now. Obviously, the Conservative Party is still 20 points behind in the polls, in some polls closer to 30 points behind. It's the most extraordinary situation, and I don't think many of your colleagues perhaps assumed that that your party would still be this far behind after getting in Rishi Sunak. Wasn't he supposed to fix everything?
Well, I think a lot of colleagues might well be now regretting the action they took against Boris Johnson. And the situation with Rishi is an interesting one. You know, the membership of the Conservative Party, the ones who get out there and do the campaigning, voted 2-1 for Liz Truss and not for Rishi. Well, we all know what happened with Liz Truss, and Rishi is now our Prime Minister. I mean, there's no hunger for change. But nevertheless, I mean, there will be growing concerns, particularly if we do badly in the local elections in May. But what happens then, I don't know. I mean, listen, nobody likes defenestrations. I mean, the party became unpopular because of what happened to Boris. We could become even more unpopular if anything were to happen to Rishi. So I think the general view at the moment, certainly my view at the moment, is just let Rishi get on with the job.
And yet, in your view, the May elections might be some sort of time to reassess where the party is. If the party does very, very badly in the May elections, can you see a route for perhaps, maybe not a leadership contest, but maybe resetting the dial to perhaps where things were before the summer?
Well, members of Parliament want to remain members of Parliament, and when they feel their positions threatened because of unpopular leadership, they sometimes take action. Now, we had too much action, I would argue, in 2022. Whether there'll be more action in 2023, we shall see. But this is where the pressure lies on Jeremy Hunt. Jeremy will be appearing before the 1922 committee tomorrow and talking to us about the budget, which is on March the 15th, before the local elections. Now, if Jeremy is ultra-cautious and doesn't give some tax breaks, doesn't give some red meat, and just continues with an attitude that, well, things have got to remain as they are, then I think we will do badly in the local elections. And I think Jeremy Hunt will have some questions to answer.
That's a really stark assessment. Jeremy Hunt appearing before you all tomorrow in private, behind closed doors. What do you assess your colleagues are going to be saying to him out of the gaze of the view of the media?
Well, I think they'll be asking for some personal tax cuts. Now, it could be that Jeremy is simply arguing that, you know, he's not going to give away the budget. He can't do that. But he's been sort of laying the groundwork that there aren't going to be changes. What was it he said over the weekend? The biggest tax cut will be my lowering inflation. But we know that inflation is reducing because price rises are not going up further. So consequently, 1 year after the following year, the way you measure inflation, it will go down by a half by the end of the year. I think colleagues will say, that's not enough, Jeremy. You've got to give us something more.
And just very finally, we're running close on time, but if Jeremy Hunt doesn't offer you what you're asking, if those local elections go badly, might Boris Johnson potentially be seen on the horizon as that man to maybe dig the party out of where it is?
Well, firstly, Boris has got to get through his investigation in Parliament. If he gets through that, well, you know what Boris is like. He could be back in the game. Anything could happen.
Back in the game. Well, Michael Fabricant, thank you so much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Always a pleasure to have you here and to go through those really seismic issues. But we were just mentioning the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, there, and on Friday last week he said it's time to believe in Britain. He said that in that usual low-energy tone that we've come to know from our Chancellor in a speech to Bloomberg's London headquarters. He defended not cutting taxes, saying that that best tax cut is a cut to inflation. But he also promised to use what he called Brexit freedoms to boost growth in the UK. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Eamon Butler, an economist and director of the Adam Smith Institute. Dr. Eamon, thank you so much for joining us this morning. What did you make of Jeremy Hunt's speech? It seemed to be more directed towards the markets than the general public.
Yes, well, I think fine words, but fine words don't necessarily make it so. And, he talked about housing and he talked about education and talked about enterprise, but I yet to see very much firm action which is going to deliver all of these things. So we've still got the highest taxes since the end of World War II. The average person spends half of their working life to pay taxes. But meanwhile, we still have huge waste in the public sector, and there doesn't seem to be any appetite to tackle that. We've got an inefficient National Health Service. What are we doing? Well, the plan is throw more money at it. Well, that's like putting more petrol in a rusty engine. It's not going to get you anywhere.
It's interesting, Jeremy Hunt is sort of a fascinating political figure because when he stood to become the leader of the Conservative Party, as he has now done twice, he stood on a manifesto of cutting corporation tax, first to 12.5% and in his second run to 15%. Now, these were two big seismic cuts that he said would boost growth. But since he became Chancellor, He's raised corporation tax. It's the most remarkable turnaround. I wonder, in your years running the Adam Smith Institute, have you had any dealings with Jeremy Hunt? What does Jeremy Hunt actually believe?
Well, I think the poor man is under orders. I think that Rishi Sunak has long, even when he was Chancellor himself, he'd long made the case that we can't afford tax cuts. We have to maintain taxes and so on, and get ourselves out of debt. Well, to some extent that is true, but we're in debt not because we don't tax enough. We're in debt because we spend too much. But I think Jeremy Hunt is under orders, and I think he knows. And I know that corporation taxes on companies, are about the most damaging tax that we have. That and stamp duty, land tax on housing transactions, and inheritance tax. These are very, very damaging taxes. And I think corporation tax actually produces a net negative return to the Treasury because the amount of business which it strangles, you don't get the tax in from the businesses and from the workers who work in those businesses and the VAT on their products and all the rest of it. So corporation tax really does have to go. In fact, there's no point just talking about putting it up a bit, putting it down a bit. We really ought to scrap it, frankly.
Is this potentially a short-term versus long-term view sort of thing? Now, I assume what you mean by under orders is that this Treasury orthodoxy that exists that really cares about balancing things in the short term and thinks less about the growth prospects for the long term. Is it that short-termist mindset that seems to have gripped hold of all of our politics right now?
Well, I think everybody is aware that it takes a couple of years before a tax cut actually shows you much positive effect. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why Liz Truss rushed into tax cuts, because she knew, right, there's an election coming in 2 years' time, two and a bit years. And if we don't start cutting tax now, we're not going to have anything to show in 2.5 years' time. So I think everybody is aware of that. And I think probably the feeling in the government, certainly in Downing Street, is that, rather than rush into this and it doesn't really work before the next election, why don't we maintain taxes at a high level and then we can show people that we are actually getting the debt down. But as yet, there's no indication that they are actually getting the debt down.
And my gosh, if a tax cut takes at least 2 years to sort of show its effect in the real economy, regulatory reform must take even longer. The business, the pro-enterprise effects of changing and liberalising our regulatory structure, that may well take even longer to sort of filter through into real seismic growth.
Well, I think there are some things that you could do pretty quickly. As I say, corporation tax is a real barrier to people starting up and growing businesses because it increases the risk. But there are small things you could do on the regulatory side. Once this Act of Parliament gets through the House of Lords and we can actually start cutting some EU legacy regulation, to do things like allow small firms to have employees, workers who are basically self-employed, promote the gig economy rather than have everybody employed. The Inland Revenue loves to have everybody employed rather than self-employed because they think it's easy to get money out of them. And there's innumerable Brexit deregulation opportunities that we could do, and we could promote more personal training, things like that. We give people loans to go to university, but we don't give them loans to get skills for work. So I think there's a lot of deregulation and positive initiatives that can be done that would, I think, bear some fruit very soon. We really need to show people that enterprise is on the up. And I think just talking about it is not enough.
Well, Dr. Eamon Butler, you have superbly set me up for my very next guest. We will be talking about EU law in our next slot. For now, thank you for joining us on The Briefing. As I was mentioning there, finally this morning, the retained EU law bill is something that we've been following closely on The Briefing, covering thousands of those EU laws that are still on our statute books. Yet the painstaking progress in ensuring that law can be repealed can sometimes overlook the divergence that is already taking place. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the day that we left the EU's single market, we may well have frozen their laws in ours. But that freeze was from that point. The EU has, since that point, continued to pass bizarre new regulations, the kind we became used to in our pages of newspapers, meaning that even by the UK doing nothing at all, as the EU continues to move, our laws have already started to diverge from theirs. Now, this morning, we're talking about crickets and how they may find our way into their pizza, chocolate, or even beer. It sounds fantastical, but let's make sense of it all now with Stephen Barrett, a barrister at Radcliffe Chambers. Stephen, what is this stuff about EU crickets?
Right. So a few years ago, in 2015, the EU decided to put insects into the food chain. And they did that by modifying the law. And then they allowed a body called the European Food Standards Agency to authorise some insects into the food chain. As far as I can tell, the first one they authorised were dried yellow mealworms. And what attracted my attention last week was that, as you say, divergence is happening because the EU is carrying on with its policy, which it wants insects in the food chain. And we have separated from it, so we're no longer automatically doing what the EU says. So last week, the EU authorised partially defatted cricket powder into the food chain. And as you say, they've authorised it into beer and pizza. Whether or not you want insects in the food chain is a political decision. So there will be people, no doubt, listening to this who say, well, look, I want insects in the food chain. This is a growing industry. You know, it's got, and there's the counter political argument. There's always the counter political argument. What happens inside the EU is that the arguments are not made. They're not discussed in public, and they're not something that the public can participate in. Those people who do want insects in the food chain should know that I'm not saying I'm not anti-insects in the food chain. I'm completely neutral. But they'd also, I think, find this new law quite curious, because the other thing the EU has done, and if you're sort of pro-free markets and pro-new products and pro-insects, the EU has given a 5-year monopoly to one company to put partially defatted cricket powder into the food chain. That is inherently curious itself. I mean, that is itself a political decision. And it's not part of the tradition of our laws. I mean, if our parliament started passing laws giving specific named companies monopolies, the press, I think, would rightly pick that up. But
cards on the table here. I'm a bit of a free market leaning guy. I would have thought that the state has no business in telling someone what they can and can't sell as long as it's not poisonous. I wouldn't mind a shop selling, I don't know, dried cricket powder if they wanted to. I might not want to buy it, but it's their prerogative. It seems very odd the way in which the EU is doing it, and illustrative more than anything else of the way in which our laws may well be already diverging by not doing anything at all. I wonder, do we have any idea of how many regulations the EU is passing to this end at the moment? I mean, if we were to stay still for another sort of year or two, how different would our law look from the EU's regulatory playbook?
It would look very different. I mean, there are hundreds of changes happening, and this is relevant to us because the EU still runs Northern Ireland. So whilst we are diverging, I mean Great Britain. I mean England, Wales, and Scotland. We are diverging. Northern Ireland is if you like, pulling away from us. Recently, I think it was last year, the EU banned the use of titanium oxide as a food dye. That's another one. That's another difference, a divergence that has happened. We still permit it. This question of risk that you raise is very interesting, because partially defatted cricket powder does carry, and the EU recognise this, a risk of something they call primary sensitization, which I think is a medical condition, and a risk of anaphylactic shock. Now, what they've done is look at the science provided by the company, and the EU has made the decision that those risks are too small to justify banning it, and too small to justify a warning label going on it. And again, That's a political decision.
Yes, but it's taken without the sort of process that you'd expect normal elected politicians in open debate to have made. I suppose that's the big issue with the EU. It's all behind closed doors. It's done by this big bureaucracy. Stephen, I could talk to you for hours about this. Sadly, the programme is at its end, but thank you so much, as always, for joining us here on The Briefing this morning. Really appreciate your time. That's it for us this morning. Thank you for joining us, and do stick with us here on GB News, because up next, the Prime Minister will be speaking in Newcastle for a Prime Minister Connect event. Bev Turner today will be covering that live.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family.
Join us. Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you. GB News will always stay honest, balanced and fair. We want to hear whatever is on your mind.
And we don't talk down to you.
The establishment had their chance.
Now we're here to represent you.
Britain's watching.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing. You see, amazing.
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News,